I'm joined by my colleagues Tanya Friesendahl and Joni Gillis, and they're going to be participating with me today, helping me out run the webinar and also perhaps answering some of your questions. So we'll go ahead and get started with the outcomes for today. They are fourfold. We're starting with a review of the requirements, and they have not changed dramatically. If you have participated in one of these in the past, you will recognize much of the content, but we always have some new information. We're going to review the requirements for private schools. Joni Gillis, as I mentioned, is joining us. She is the new ombudsman for private schools. So we'll talk about private schools a little. We'll give you an update on allocations and answer any questions that you might have. If you have questions as we're going along today, please feel free to type them into the chat. We have muted everybody on entry so that we don't get feedback over the phone, but please type your questions in and Tanya will be monitoring the chat, and then we'll also have time at the end for any questions if you don't have any as we go along. Just a reminder, we start with this slide every year, that the goal of Title IIA is really to improve outcomes for students. And we do that through supporting educators in improving their practice and helping them get the skills and knowledge that they need to meet their students' needs. But it's important to keep in mind that equity of educational opportunity is a real focus of Title IIA. How are we making sure that we are getting excellent teachers in front of all of our students, but in particular keeping in mind that we're providing equitable access so that students in specific groups are not represented or taught by teachers who are less qualified or experienced than others. So this is just a reminder each year that we talk about the goal of the project of Title IIA. We have, the federal government does provide what we call non-regulatory guidance, and we post that on our website at the end of this presentation. I have included a slide that has links to a number of helpful resources. This is one of them. So the new guidance is titled Building Systems of Support for Excellent Teaching and Leading. As I shared with you last year, the format for this guidance is much more narrative than its predecessor under NCLB, which was a very question and answer format. And as we've also discussed, with the reauthorization of ESEA under ESSA, we now have a broader focus on well-rounded education. We have much more inclusivity in terms of the kinds of subjects and individuals that can participate in Title IIA, but this guidance does really highlight thinking about the strategic use of Title IIA funds and really looking at systems to support educators, systems to support students, and designing district systems to really maximize all of your investments, but in this particular case, Title IIA. So if you have not gotten a copy of that guidance, I highly recommend it. That is what we use when you send us your questions. That's the first place we go to try to help us in crafting our answer to you.
There's a question around who at ODE oversees all of the federal programs.
We have a new federal programs director named Deb Lang. So she oversees all of the programs. Title IIA is actually not on the federal systems team, but I collaborate with my colleagues in federal systems. So Deb Lang would be the director who oversees all of the federal programs. Perfect. Okay. So we'll go ahead and move into application requirements. There are 5 tabs on the Title IIA application, and you access that through this SIP budget narrative on the Secure District site. The only reason I listed these 5 here is to really articulate for you that it's numbers 2, 3, and 5 that are really where effort needs to be put when filling out the application. The overview is really just a description of the purpose of 2A, so you don't actually do anything with that tab. And the spending page, a couple of years ago, we were able to modify the budget narrative page to allow you to enter information by object code. So So now the spending page essentially populates itself. So it's the needs assessment, the budget narrative, and then the equitable services worksheet, which we'll talk about a little later. Those are the three primary areas of the application that you'll be interfacing with. Each year, we do a reminder of what is the purpose of a needs assessment. And in the case of Title IIA, it really is to help districts answer the question, what professional learning and support do teachers and principals, and now under ESSA, other school leaders need to help students succeed? That is what the question that you'll be seeking to answer as you develop your, or look through your data and develop your plan. It is not a special Title IIA needs assessment. It is in the application, we are simply asking for you to describe the process that you used, and you likely, most districts have a comprehensive needs assessment process, continuous improvement process. So the 2A application is simply asking you to communicate what you learned from that needs assessment process. These four items represent the four main fields in the needs assessment section that you're asked to address. The first one being around data. So this is listing the data sources that were examined, and that is both student data and educator data. So you're taking both of those sets of information. We know that student achievement data is valuable and has its place, but there are multiple sources of data on students to be considered outside of achievement data, including things like perception data, demographic data, there's attendance, behavior, there's school program data, there's all sorts of sources that you can tap when you're doing that analysis. And then in terms of educators, of course, many districts do a survey of their educators, which has a great value, but there are other sources of educator data to be considered, including data that you can gather through your evaluation and support system about teacher strengths and areas for growth that can help you identify trends across the district that will be valuable as you make considerations about your prioritized needs. Just want to emphasize that charter schools, district-sponsored charter schools, are part of the district, and their data needs to be included in this analysis. So that means any student data from the charter school and any educator from the charter school, educator data, should be included in your analysis. And then you look through all that data, right? And you identify gaps, areas of need, and that informs those prioritized needs, where you identify what is it that our educators need in order to improve their practice and support their students. And we do call them prioritized needs because we recognize that you will have many needs and may not be able to address all of them with Title IIA funds. So thinking back to that guidance slide that I shared a little earlier, how can we really strategically use those funds and focus on a few areas with Title IIA funds in your larger pool of needs? So you are likely already working to braid and blend funds and support several prioritized needs using multiple resource streams. And then lastly, we ask you to just tell us about how the plan was developed, who was involved, who participated, and sometimes that is included in the description of the data analysis. Some people actually, some districts describe how they analyze their data in that section too. So if you do that, it's fine to just say in the fourth field, you know, this information is included in section 2. You do have to have something typed in each of those 4 boxes or the application will not allow you to submit. The next section is the budget narrative, and this is the meat of the application. This is where you are going to be talking about your activities, what strategies you're going to engage in order to support those educators in supporting their students. And I wanted to take just a moment to remind all of us of the definition of professional learning. ESSA has re-emphasized that professional learning is high quality, sustained, classroom focused, and not one-day or short-term workshops or conferences. We know that professional learning is not just going to a class and sitting in a room. There are lots of different models of professional learning that include collaboration, differentiation, and it's important for us to think about professional learning in that broader context. But the fact that the guidance does call out short-term and one-day workshops, we do want to talk about what is the place of those types of activities within Title IIA. We know that sending individuals to conferences can have value, and we know that often districts send folks out to gather information and become kind of a train the trainer and support other people back in their district. So conferences and workshops can be approvable as part of Title IIA as long as it's articulated how they're part of a larger strategy and not simply an end in themselves. So thinking about the role of the conference in the prioritized need, how is it the springboard for the work that will then be followed up with more job-embedded professional learning, and how are you going to ensure that that content is shared across the larger community or with those individuals for whom it would have benefit, so that it doesn't just stay with the individuals who attended. So we definitely see that conferences and workshops can have their value as long as they're part of a larger plan for professional learning. I'm going to pause for just a minute, Tanya, and ask if you've seen any new questions come through. Nope. No? Okay. So when you are creating those line items and thinking about describing the strategies that you're going to undertake, we have talked in previous years about just including the what, the who, and the how. So the what is about the intended objective. What prioritized need is the strategy related to? What is the knowledge and skills that staff will receive? And how are you spending those funds? And we'll show an example in a minute of what we're talking about. And then we're also asking you now to just remember that whatever your description of the what includes, being clear on how that strategy meets the definition of professional learning. And that doesn't mean that you have to say, this activity meets the definition by X, Y, and Z. It's just that in the narrative, you are articulating how it is ongoing, sustained, job embedded, that kind of thing. And again, I'll show you an example in just a moment. So articulating kind of the frequency and that sort of thing will be helpful for reviewers as they read through these, as they read through your application. Then in terms of the who, it's very straightforward. We just want to have a sense of, are we talking about teachers, paraprofessionals, administrators, and roughly how many people? And the reason that we ask for the how many is because one of the requirements of Title IIA is that costs be reasonable and necessary. And this just gives us a sense of the amount of funds being spent and how many educators it will impact. That helps us out. Then the last one, the how, we're asking you to shift your thinking about the how. It used to be that we asked you to tell us how the funds will be spent, and we have sort of folded that into the what. We're asking you, when you tell us about the what, give us an idea. Are you hiring a person? Are you paying for substitutes? Where is that money going? Now for the how, we really want you to start thinking about how will you measure the impact of what you're doing. What is your plan for knowing whether or not the activity you are engaging in is generating the results you're expecting? On this next slide, you'll see the continuous improvement cycle. This is a graphic that the 2A guidance calls a cyclical framework, but I'm sure you all recognize the components of it. And that fifth circle, examine and reflect, really is what the how is about. Evaluating the effectiveness of professional learning is arguably the most critical step, and we usually have a pretty clear vision and plan for implementation, but the evaluation of professional learning is sometimes an afterthought. And when that happens, it really means that there's no way of knowing whether your investment in that professional learning paid off. So knowing what you expect the impact to be and how you're going to be checking on that impact will really help you in deciding whether you want to continue that practice in the future and whether you're getting what you were anticipating. I do want to say that impact is not restricted to student achievement. It is not just did students' performance improve. It can include student performance, but it can also include impact on educator practice. So it could, evidence of impact could be surveys, it could be educator evaluation data, it could be information on student attendance, behavior, course participation, graduation rate. There are lots of different things that impact can look like. So I do want to make sure that we're clear that it is not just student achievement. The PowerPoint has been posted. Shelley sent me a text about 15 minutes ago saying it was up on the website. And we'll also post the webinar once we have it closed captioned. We have requirements now for accessibility to close caption all of our webinars, so it takes a little longer than it used to get them up on the web, but we'll get it up as soon as we can for our colleagues. So I'm going to show you an example here of a line item, and I apologize that it's a little distorted. I did my best to try to fit it to the slide, make it large enough to read. I wasn't 100% successful, but this example talks about instructional support for new teachers and a mentor TOSA. And they have identified the need that it's related to, and it's just numbered, so the reviewer can go back and look if they want to see what the title of it was, or you can put the whole title of your need. It's entirely up to you. Then in the what, they describe that they're talking about salary and payroll costs, so I know how the money is being spent. They're hiring a TOSA. They describe what that TOSA is going to do around providing support on instructional strategies, who she or he is providing that support to, how it's going to improve, or what knowledge and skills the teachers will get. And then at the end, it talks about providing support throughout the year through staff meetings, training days, model teaching, and individualized support. So they're identifying that it is ongoing and sustained professional learning throughout the year. They identify the number of teachers and subjects that are impacted, and then they include how they are going to know whether this TOSA is having the impact that they're looking for. So surveys from those teachers, observations to see whether those strategies and skills that she's supporting are actually being used, and then exit interviews with their probationary teachers who may choose to leave. So they've covered all of the primary categories that we've asked for in this line item. And this example, along with a couple of others, are included in the updated budget narrative guidance that we have on the website. We know that no example is perfect. Every time we provide an example, we are reminded of ways that we can improve them. But we did want to give you some sort of a target to get a sense of the kind of information that we're looking for. A couple of quick reminders. We know that the impact of strategies may take several years of implementation to really come to fruition. It's not realistic to expect that an activity implemented at the beginning of the year is going to generate huge results for students by the end of that year. And so districts are encouraged to continue to implement effective strategies from year to year. We do ask that, and because your reviewer is consistent over time, we do become familiar with your narratives and recognize when you're continuing activities. But we ask that you include some evidence of how you know it's effective. So back to that evidence of impact that I was talking about earlier. Again, it doesn't have to be student achievement data, but if you are continuing to engage, for example, in peer feedback, peer observation, you've been doing it for a couple of years, some sort of information about how you know that that is benefiting your teachers, whether it's through survey data, perception data from those teachers, or some other source, is helpful to us so that we know that you are monitoring that, the effectiveness of that strategy. And then in terms of reconciling applications, we know that when you submit your application in the fall, you have a plan, and that plans can go awry for any number of reasons, not the least of which is the number of participants, weather, all kinds of things. So we appreciate it when districts update their application to show what they actually did. This is of benefit to you because you have an internal reconciliation of what you did versus what you said you were going to do, and it can benefit you if you're being monitored so that you have an alignment between what your spending says and what your application says. But it's not necessary to resubmit your application every time you make a change. We would recommend that you resubmit anytime you are adding an activity so that we can confirm that it does in fact align with Title IIA requirements, or anytime you're having a large shift in funding. So you may have submitted an application, it was approved, and you were spending $50,000 on one activity and $50,000 on another, and then it was determined based on your experience and data analysis that perhaps one is much more effective than the other, and you want to switch, spending more on the second than the first. If you're shifting large amounts of money, we would appreciate you reconciling that through your application. Again, just so that there's alignment between what you're spending and what your application says you are doing. Okay, I'm going to pause before we start talking about private schools and equitable services. Were there any new questions that came up?
There hasn't been any new questions in the chat box.
Okay. All right. Private schools and equitable services. We did hold a webinar in February specifically on private schools as an opportunity to support districts as they began thinking about their consultation process for the year. So if you attended that webinar, you may recognize a few of these slides. Just a reminder that the goal of consultation is really to make sure that the private school and the district are having conversations about what kind of support to provide to eligible private schools. They are entitled to an equitable share of the funds, and their teachers are entitled to support. And so communication between the district and the school is really important. It's incumbent on the district to engage in that consultation. The consultation needs to be timely and meaningful. That's a quote from the guidance, and it does happen annually. We recommend that late February or early March is when you start having those conversations. There are materials available on the private school participation under ESSA webpage. I've put a link in here. The Transact forms, links to the Transact forms are there. There's also materials to support you with consultation. So I would encourage you, if you've not been to that website, to go. You can obviously access it through this link. It is also linked off of the main Title IIA page. There's a whole series of, there's a guidance page and an allocations page, and there's also a link to the private school participation under ESSA webpage.
So we do have a question on what is considered to be a large amount of money.
Oh, what is considered to be well, that's a good question. I guess large is all relative, depending on your allocation. But I guess I would say if you are doubling or tripling the amount of money that you are spending on a particular activity, that might be a good rule of thumb. You could also contact, if you have a question, because that's a valid question. I hadn't thought of it from that perspective. If you have a question about that, don't hesitate to contact your reviewer and just say, hey, this is what we're looking at doing. Do you think that this qualifies as something that I need to really resubmit for? That would probably be the best way to handle that. Good question.
And then we have a question, how do we effectively consult in the spring when we don't know our allocations?
Well, I would say, and Joni is here with me, so she may choose to chime in. I don't think that the consultation is just about how much money will the private school receive. The consultation is about, does the private school wish to participate? What are the obligations if the private school chooses to participate? What is the process that the district and the school will engage in if they participate? I can imagine that a private school might say, well, my participation depends on how much money I'm getting because I want to know if it's going to be worth my time. So I recognize that our allocation timeline is not in line with the timeline that we're giving you for consultation, and I wish that I could change that, but I can't. It's dependent on the federal government. So I would say that at the very least, having a conversation about if our allocation does not change, dramatically, you should expect a similar amount, and would you be interested in participating, and what would the process be that we would go through? So that's about the best I think I can say at this, and Joni is nodding her head, so it sounds like she agrees. Transferring funds. I just added this slide this year because we saw an uptick in the number of districts choosing to move funds between federal programs, which districts are perfectly entitled to do. And there are lots of reasons why districts might do that and why it might be of benefit. I just wanted to elevate the fact that if a district is planning on shifting their allocation, they do need to make sure that the private school is aware that that is their intention for a couple of reasons. One being, it may be that a district has participated in Title II for a number of years, and if the district is choosing to shift its Title II funds over to Title I, the private school needs to be aware that the Title II allocation is shrinking, so that their pot is shrinking. They also need to be aware that they're eligible to participate in Title I. Maybe they've never participated in Title I before, but but now they might have reason to if it looks like they could benefit from that. So this is just a reminder that part of that consultation should be a conversation with the private school about whether or not there's going to be a shift in those funds.
So we had a question about the formula for determining allocations changed in Title IA. Has the formula for determining Title IIA also changed?
We are going to be talking about allocations in a few short minutes, so stay tuned. So calculating equitable services, again, if a district has private schools that wish to participate, then the equitable service amount is based on the district's total allocation minus its administrative costs. And those costs are really, what does it cost the district to operate the grant, both at the district level and for the private school? So any costs associated with things like having those meetings, negotiating contracts, doing any of the work that is associated with the actual implementation of the grant, all of those things would be considered administrative costs. The caveat would be that the total that you could deduct for administrative costs before you calculate the equitable share can't exceed the district's indirect rate. So the private school does need to be assured that they are getting their equitable share in that regard. I do this as a reminder every year because we get this question. The equitable services worksheet that is in the application will do the calculating for you. It asks you to enter some information, primarily enrollment information. And when they talk about total enrollment, they want to know the total enrollment for the district and the total enrollment for the private school. That is different than Title IA. So I just want to be clear that total enrollment means all kids in the district and all kids in the private school. And then the worksheet will calculate that combination for you. In terms of private school line items and strategies, those line items should follow the same format as the district. So private schools, when you consult with them and they choose to participate, when they tell you what they want to do, they should be able to articulate for you the what, the who, and the how, just like we ask you to do. It is sometimes the case that private schools are not prepared to say what their activities are going to be. Maybe their needs assessment has not been completed. There are all sorts of reasons. And the district application does not need to be held up because private schools are not yet ready to say how they are spending their money. So it is always allowable for the district to create a line item that simply says the name of the school, the date of consultation, and the amount that's being allocated, and the understanding that the district will ensure that whatever the private school chooses to engage in will meet with 2A requirements. But if they do know, when they do know what they're doing, the what, the who, and the how is the format that they should share with you. A reminder that their activities are based on their needs assessment, And many districts are collaborative with their private schools and offer them the opportunity to participate in district-provided professional learning. And if that matches the needs of the private school, that is an excellent way to leverage funds and collaborate. But private schools can choose to engage in professional learning that is not related to work being done by or at the district, and they need to be assured that their activities are meeting their needs. As a reminder, almost everything that is allowable under Title IIA for districts is allowable for private schools, with the exception of paying for salaries, benefits, and substitutes. Those are not allowable uses of 2A for private schools, nor is participation in any professional learning that has religious content. And we have lots of examples of schools that have attended a a religious conference and attended sessions that secular sessions were offered. And so that portion of the conference or professional learning that is not religious in nature can be covered through Title IIA.
So we have a couple questions. We've been asked in the past that private schools need to outline their plans for spending the funds. Do they no longer have to identify their professional development plans when they submit their needs assessment?
Best practice for everybody is to have a needs assessment and a professional development plan, a long-term plan, same for private schools as would be for a district. There is a section of the guidance that talks about administrative burden for private schools, which essentially says that the district cannot require a specific format and undue burden on the district to articulate. You can't necessarily have a prescribed application to the private school for their funds. However, private schools are required to identify their needs. They have to tie their needs just like the district does. They have to tie their activities to their needs and articulate how they're going to be spending the funds. So that might happen as part of the consultation or part of follow-up after the consultation. So they do need to articulate what their needs are and what activities they're going to undertake and what it will cost.
But there's not a set
format or document that they have to fill out for that purpose.
Okay. Another question. So I'm hearing that the district can deduct for both indirect and admin costs, and the admin costs cannot exceed the amount equal to the indirect.
You cannot deduct any more money from your allocation than what would be the total cost of your indirect rate. So that would include administrative costs. So if you have no administrative costs, then you're not deducting any costs for that. You might have indirect costs, but you can't have the total cost of someone's salary plus the total indirect rate and deduct both of those. That would not be the case.
What about stipends for private schools?
Stipends are totally fine.
All right, those are the questions so far.
Okay. Two reminders about private schools. Every year we get a phone call from a district saying, we have a school that went ahead and paid for attendance at a conference and they want us to reimburse them. This is a reminder that the district is the fiscal agent. You are not reimbursing private schools. That's important to communicate as part of your consultation. If the school is going to attend a conference, if they want to purchase materials, if they want to bring in a consultant, all of that needs to be done through the process with the district. Also a reminder that carryover no longer applies to private schools. Beginning with last year's allocation, the 17-18 allocation, private schools are obligated to spend all their funds in the year that they're allocated. So they have from July 1 for the upcoming funds, they have from July 1 of 2018 to September 30th of 2019 to engage in activities using those funds. And any funds that remain are not available to them. I think I should probably have changed the slide to say Ombudsperson. instead of ombudsman. Russ, some of you may remember Russ Sweet was filling in for a while as our ombudsman. He has officially retired, but we are lucky enough to have Joni Gillis rejoin the Department of Education. Some of you may remember her from her previous tenure at the department. She has joined us as the Ombudsperson. And this is just a reminder of what her role is in the 2A process. She can attend consultations. That's not expected that she's attending every consultation with every private school, but if there was a feeling of need between the private school and the district for her attendance, it is possible for her to engage in that. She does ensure compliance with ESSA and handles, she's really the primary point of contact for addressing concerns. So if there's a question like was just asked a minute ago, are stipends allowable for Title IIA? That would be a question for me. But if there's a concern about the communication or collaboration or relationship between the private school and the district on either side, Joni would be the person to contact. And I've got her email listed there, and she's of course listed on the website as well. Is there anything you wanted to add, Joni?
I think that's a good definition right there.
Okay, perfect.
And we have another question. We always expected administrative costs to be identified in the activity items, such as salary and benefits of a grant administrator. So they deduct from the total budget. We've not allowed just a random amount related to meetings, etc. Do we need to readdress this in our next meeting?
No, I think what I was trying to articulate on that slide, so I apologize if it has caused confusion. What I was trying to articulate is that it is important that private schools receive their equitable share. And some districts do have an individual whose salary is paid out of Title IIA to manage their grant, and that is a perfectly allowable expense. That is also an allowable expense to deduct from the overall allocation, but that deduction cannot exceed what would be considered the indirect rate for the district. That is what I was trying to communicate. So I don't think it matters whether what you are deducting is the cost for the individual who is managing the grant, or whether if you don't have someone who's doing that, you just have a random person who will engage in those consultations briefly, but that's all that they do. Either of those things are allowable deductions. It just can't exceed the district's indirect rate, because otherwise the private school is not receiving its equitable share.
So how do we pay stipends for private school staff? Do the private school teachers have to become employees of the district to receive stipends? My district business office is not sure how to proceed with stipends for private school staff.
That is a good question, a good follow-up question. I don't know if Joni has
some districts have a pretty good system in place. So what I can do is kind of pick their brain and then maybe do some just kind of general guidance on how that might look for the districts.
And then post it on the website?
Yes.
All right.
And we could send it out on the listserv.
Send it out.
Yeah,
Send
that'd
it
be
out
perfect. Okay, because that is a question we get, and we do know, for example, like when private school teachers go to a conference and they have to do their own food, and there are some things that they might need to be reimbursed for. And I do know that districts will reimburse individual teachers, but knowing what that process is would be helpful. Thank you, Joni.
And I think that next question is about clarification. So any conference costs they attend this summer, private schools, would still apply to their
go through September.
Yes, they can spend their funds through September. They can engage in activities through September 30th. Yes, so if they're planning to attend something this summer, they should be talking with you about registering them and making flight arrangements and that kind of thing.
And that would come out of their
17-18 allocation. Correct.
If there's anything else. Oh, yes. I tried to spend my 17-18 funds in August of 2017 and was told I could not spend the funds until the money came in, which was in October. I'm curious, should I have access to the money as soon as July 1st in 2018?
All right, I need you to back up and read that again. That was a lot of information.
Okay. I tried to spend my 17-18 funds in August of 2017 and was told I could not spend the funds until the money seemed.
Oh, okay. So she's, all right. So you knew already what you wanted to do for that budget year. Yes, funds are, I'm using air quotes, available July 1st. But what really happens is, and we're going to move into allocations now, so this is probably a good transition. What really happens is the federal government provides the Department of Ed with our state allocation. They provide that in late June or early July. Once they tell us how much we have as a state, then we identify what the district allocations are, and they need to be loaded into EGMs. So probably in your case, what happened was you were ready to go and you wanted to claim the funds right away, and they were not available in EGMs. That is my guess. So you can engage in activities starting July 1 with the 18-19 funds. You absolutely can. So a private school could go to a conference in the summer of 2018 with 18-19 funds. They don't know how much money they have yet, so that could be a little dicey. But I think the issue that you're elevating has to do with our EGM system. It's the claim system as opposed to whether it's allowable to engage in those. So you can do something on July 1 if you choose to. You just can't claim the funds yet because we don't have them in EGMs. That's my understanding.
Okay, and I just had information. People needed your information. So Portland Public has a good process set up through the Archdiocese, so that would be a good.
Oh, for stipends?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yeah.
Portland Public, great.
I was going to talk to Kathy. You get
Okay,
All righty.
okay.
Okay.
Scrolling through.
Yep, we pay stipends to private school teachers who participate in Title II activities, usually a PLC that is written into the PD plan. The activity must occur outside their contracted hours, and they must submit a W-9 since it would be considered salary, unlike a reimbursement for travel or training. All right.
Kathy.
Are you saying you can spend funds before the application is approved?
I am saying that you can engage in so the period for which funds are allocated is July 1 to September 30th. That's the initial grant period. So I am saying that it is allowable to engage in activities beginning July 1. You're right that you don't yet know how much money you have. Many districts do not engage in activities until they know how much money they have. You also have to have submitted, so you can attend something, but you haven't submitted an application yet. So there's a chance that you'll say, this looks like a really good activity, we want to go, we're going to do it. Then you submit your application saying this is the activity, and we'll say, we have some concerns that it doesn't meet 2A requirements. So you are taking a chance. I mean, I'm using air quotes, but if you don't have an approved application and you engage in an activity, there's always a chance that questions will come back to you. But in terms of what is the period for which the funds are, during which activities could be undertaken, it would be July 1 through September 30. It would be a lot easier if they would give us our money earlier, and we could tell you when you are planning and budgeting, and then we wouldn't have this obstacle. So I apologize that it is more complicated than it needs to be, or that it is as complicated as it is. Maybe that's the right wording. Okay, so let's talk about funds. Someone asked earlier about the formula changing. We all remember, I'm sure, last year that the funding formula changed for Title IIA. And the primary change was the elimination of the hold harmless provision, which had acted as a floor of funding for districts. That was removed beginning with the 17-18 allocation, and many districts saw fluctuations, and in some cases, rather severe fluctuations in their funding. Some districts got a lot more money, some districts got a lot less, and that had to do with the fact that they sort of recalibrated poverty. They took a new look at where is poverty in Oregon, because they had been using the 2001 census data, and that was extremely outdated. So last year we saw big changes for many districts. The formula for funding states also changed. The formula for providing funds to districts is an 80-20 formula, 80% based on census poverty and 20% based on enrollment. At the state level, it's always been 65 poverty, 35 enrollment or total population. And they are each year now gradually moving the state allocation to be in line with the district allocation, the 80-20 formula. So beginning for 18-19, 70% of the funds that Oregon receives will be based on census poverty in the state as a whole, and 30% will be based on population of students 5 to 17 as a whole. And that will keep shifting. The next year it'll be 75-25, and then the final year it'll be 80-20. So there is going to continue to be some shift in how much money Oregon receives based on our census poverty. We do know that states will be getting 2A funds for 18-19. It is part of the approved budget. I was told by Melinda, who is our primary point person for allocations, that it was flat funding. There was no increase provided. And she did say that she anticipates a decrease in Oregon's funding because our census poverty has dropped. So that means if the state receives less money, obviously there is less money to distribute to districts. However, we're not expecting to see, we will not see the kinds of dramatic shifts that we saw last year because we now have our new normal, our new baseline. But we're suggesting that districts plan for at least a 5% decrease to compensate for what we expect is going to be a decrease in the overall state allocation. Again, we get those numbers from the USED at the end of June or early July, and then we are able to start doing the calculation for districts. I post those on the allocations page of the Title IIA page. Melinda posts those on the ESEA allocations page. I will also send out notification via the listserv. So as soon as we have those numbers, I will communicate them.
So we do have another question.
Sure.
I would think that the conversation with ODE occurred prior to the spending of the activity, then one, even though they haven't submitted their application, have sought out and received approval for the activity. Yes, no?
Oh, sure. So I think what you're asking is, if there's something you want to do, can you ask ahead of time, hey, would this be an allowable use? And I think that's a great idea. I think that's a perfect solution. And yes, we have talked to people in advance when there's an activity they want to engage in, just to check. So I think that that's a good, that would be always be fine. Randy and Suzanne are our two reviewers, and they are on the webinar today. They do work very sporadically in the summer, and so your first point of contact should usually be them, but I would always be happy, particularly during the summer, to be, if you wanted to send me an email to ask that question, especially if you have a tight timeline, I'd be happy to touch base with anybody that wanted to do that.
And Sarah Martin is the one that's talking, and I have put her email into the chat box as well.
Oh, and it's on the last slide, don't worry.
Okay. We just had a few people asking.
Okay, yeah, it's on the last slide.
And then my understanding from your funding update is that districts with higher poverty will then see increases for the 18-19 school year. Yes, no?
No, I don't believe that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that last year we saw funding shift because poverty shifted. So now you are identified, each district now has its sort of new census poverty numbers. I would not expect those districts that received big funding shifts last year to have another big funding shift this year. I'm saying I think they'll stay relatively stable now that we have our new baseline. So it does mean districts who had a decrease last year are still going to have that same kind of lower allocation like they did this year, but there shouldn't be a big fluctuation.
And they're planning for 5%.
Planning, everybody should plan for 5% because the state is going to lose funds. That's what we're anticipating. So this timeline slide, maybe I'll remind myself that this should go earlier next time because we've talked about this now a couple of times based on questions that you've had. So the grant funds are available for a total of 27 months. It begins on July 1 of 2018 and ends on September 30th of 2020. So there's a total of 27 months. The first period is a 15-month period that ends September 30th. of 2019. And any funds that you've not obligated, any funds that you have not conducted activities for, will become carryover funds. And then you can access those carryover funds through the carryover application that usually opens in November. And you can engage in activities through September 30th of 2020. Some districts spend all their funds in the first period, and that is totally fine. But if you don't, it's those carryover funds that you'll access through the carryover application. Then I just included a few dates, a few helpful dates. Some of these are approximate, right? So the application for 2018-19 will open in August. Sometimes it opens earlier than mid-August, but I'm putting August 15th as a target approximate date. But last year it was earlier than that, and I'll certainly communicate when I know if it's earlier. September 30th, again, is the end of the initial period of the 17-18 allocation. So any activities that you've undertaken by September 30th, after that September 30th date, if you haven't been, if you have funds left over, that'll run into carryover. We ask that November 1st be the due date for your Title IIA application. You are always welcome to submit it earlier, but we do have Randy and Suzanne on contract to do this work for a certain number of months. And so having those applications in sooner rather than later ensures that your application gets read in a timely manner and that we have time to ask any questions that we might have. Carryover does open in November, approximately mid-November, and that's for those funds that were left over from 17-18. And then we suggest February or March as time for consultation with private schools. Do we have another question coming up?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
How is ODE ensuring that districts engage in meaningful consultation with the stakeholders outlined in ESSA, teachers, paraprofessionals, specialized instructional support personnel, families, and community?
Well, part of the 2A needs assessment application asks you to describe the process that you undertook in developing that plan and specifically asks who was involved. If you're asking me how are we monitoring that, officially monitoring that, I think that would probably be a question for the federal programs team. I don't have direct knowledge of how they look for that information in the formal monitoring process, but I would say through the 2A application, the way we try to get at that information is through that needs assessment, that fourth question on the needs assessment, which is the process that you undertook to include folks. Just a reminder about your carryover, that your current application, so the application for the current year, so in this case it'll be 18-19, does need to be in our queue before we can read your carryover application. Many districts spend, their carryover funds first, of course, because they expire first, and that's totally reasonable. But in order for us to approve your carryover application, we have to see what your current application is, because we're asking you to tie your carryover spending to your identified needs for the current year. It doesn't have to be approved, but it has to be in the queue so that Randy and Suzanne can go and look at your needs if they need to. If that makes sense. So here's a whole big long list of resources, as I mentioned earlier. Our Title II webpage has links to resources for Title II, but also, as I mentioned, to that private school participation under ESSA. You can sign up for our listserv. I strongly encourage you, if you are not a member of the listserv, to get on it, and there is a link to the listserv on our Title II page. We have that federal non-regulatory guidance that I mentioned. We also have a document called the Oregon Federal Funds Guide that was shared last year at the pre-conference of the Summer Institute that just helps summarize the purpose and requirements of each of the federal programs, and also provide some guidance on thinking about blending funds and how to really maximize those funds as a part of a larger plan for improvement. The Course to Endorsement Catalog, which is a resource that provides information on ensuring that teachers are appropriately licensed for the courses that they teach. The Learning Forward standards, which are standards for professional learning, how to engage in effective professional learning. We always encourage districts to use those as a guide as they work with professional learning with their staff. And then we do have a document that we put together a couple of years ago around increasing the effectiveness of professional learning. So all of these are posted on the webpage.
We have another question.
Another question, all right.
With carryover, our business office director has indicated we are to spend carryover monies before we spend new current year monies. That said, our carryover only opens November 15th. I see challenges with spending out the carryover prior to its approval.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this might harken back to the conversation we had earlier, which is, can you check in with us on allowability? I think one problem I see with that with carryover is that we could potentially be talking about a lot of activities. So I'm not sure what the solution is there. If you want, if your business manager has a concern that they want to talk with us about directly, I suppose they can. But I agree with you that spending all those monies before you have an approved plan is probably not wise.
When do you anticipate the Title IIA funding allocations will be posted?
As I mentioned previously, we get the numbers from USED either at in late June or July. So if last year is any indication, I think we didn't have those numbers available until the beginning of August. I think we had them right before the Summer Institute. So I wish I could offer them sooner, but I don't have access to, I can't even calculate them until we know how much Oregon's receiving. So I apologize. Any other questions that you see sitting there?
Not yet.
Okay, so we're on the question slide. It is almost 11 o'clock straight up, but I am more than happy to stay and answer any other questions that you may have in the chat that you want to ask. I don't see any coming in. So while we wait for just a minute, I'll share the contact slide. So there's my name and email address, along with Suzanne and Rendy. As I mentioned before, they are the reviewers who read the applications, and we try to maintain consistency across years. So if you've had one or the other as your reviewer previously, we encourage you to communicate with them. If you know that you are going to be leaving your position and you know who's going to be taking it over, we really encourage you to connect that person with Rendy or Suzanne and also get them hooked up on the listserv so that they get the right information. Looks like we have another question. Is that right?
Just lots of thank yous, and really appreciated having the webinar posted prior to so that they
can great. Follow along. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, we will end right on time. And as always, if you have any additional questions, please feel free. If it's about your application, please reach out to your reviewer first. But I'm always happy to answer any questions, and I will be using the listserv as a way to communicate any new information. Thanks again.
Thank you.